Hi, Charles with SirBookSage here, and today is a special video. Today is day 4 of Kwanzaa. That day is Ujamaa, which is about collective economics. And I have been asked by Njeri of Onyx Pages to participate in her Kwanzaa Reflect-a-thon. It's a variation on a readathon where it's not a traditional TBR, read a bunch of books, do a vlog about it, and then talk about the books. It's more of taking the concepts, the 7 principles of Kwanzaa, and finding books that relate to each of those principles, that there's some connection between the books you've already read, or perhaps books you want to read, and each of these principles. And I've been asked to participate today in day 4, again, which is Ujamaa and Cooperative economics. So I will link down below to Njeri's Onyx Pages BookTube channel, which is just a fantastic channel. You can watch her announcement video. She goes into all the details of each of the 7 days and the 7 principles and all the other people who are participating in this week-long event. And Kwanzaa, for those who may not be aware, is an African-American holiday that runs from December 26th through January 1st. Each day you reflect upon a different principle. And again, Njeri has the full breakdown of each day and what the principles are. Today, it's, like I mentioned, cooperative economics. And this was a really tough challenge for me. My reading this year, I've read a lot less. In 2017, I read like 47 books and about 16,000 pages. This year, I've read about 22 books and 11,000 pages. So far fewer books, but not all that far fewer pages, because all the books I've been reading this year are big, giant, epic fantasy. I did a reread of the first couple of Song of Ice and Fire books. I reread the first trilogy of Thomas Covenant Chronicles. I'm working my way through the entire Wheel of Time. So all of my reading for the past 4 months has just been Wheel of Time. So the variety of stories I've read is very limited this year. And but I've come up with a few examples that they don't tie directly into the concept of cooperative economics, but they do, they are good stories to illustrate these concepts in a way and how they're impacted by events that happen in society. And the general breakdown of cooperative economics is it's a push for your community to also be the business owners in your community, to not just live and spend your money in your community, but for you to become the entrepreneurs, the business owners, to begin to build wealth in your community. And that is very difficult to find, particularly in speculative fiction, because whenever you come across a society that may be practicing that, it's usually always represented as a much lower technological level that usually gets conquered and exploited and all that stuff. So, but the first story I want to talk about for this subject is probably the best books I've read this year, and that is the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin. For those of you who are not aware of this, it is a sci-fi trilogy. All 3 books won the Hugo Award. She's the first author, Jemisin is, to win the Hugo Award back to back 3 years in a row. It's never happened before. And this story is deserving of that monumental and unique feat. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend you do go read it. And in terms of this Ujamaa, it's an interesting thing here because the world that the story takes place in, this isn't a spoiler because it's the first sentence of the book, and it basically opens with, let's talk about the end of the world, why don't we? It's a book that starts with the end of the world, and then what happens after that. Usually your big epic fantasy sci-fi things, there's this building and building and building towards that big sort of, and the end of an age and the upheaval of society and dark lords and all that stuff. And then the story ends. And this starts at that point. Where do you go from there? And this isn't a dark lord kind of, magic sort of thing. But humanity finds itself in a place where you exist in all these little towns. It's sort of gone or regressed back into an almost feudal sort of society in a way, where, like, let's look, just take the Middle East because it's a perfect example of it. Pre-World War I, you didn't talk about going to, there was no Syria or Iraq or any of these places. You went to Damascus or Baghdad or, Najaf, places like that. It was each city was these dominant cultural and economic and even artistic places. And the Broken Earth trilogy, humanity is just barely hanging on. And humans live in these little pockets around this continent and totally self-enclosed societies, because not only do they fear the elements, because the world itself is trying to kill them in a sense with the cataclysmic events that are called a fifth season taking place. You also have warring towns that if they're stronger than you, they're going to come and take everything you own, and then you're just going to be left to die or pretty much kind of enslaved or brought into the society if you have a useful skill. It's a brutal sort of Mad Max-esque, there's a little bit of that dystopian sort of horrible future world. But in the midst of that, you have, like I said, a town, and everyone in that town has a purpose. You have to provide something the town needs. There is no strict consumers here, that they're not tolerated because humanity can't afford it. So it's developed a caste system where you grow up and you grow into a role. Some are warriors, some are teachers, some are basically politicians, some are gardeners, every kind of function that a society needs to survive. You will fit into one of those roles, or out you go, and you're not going to survive out there in the middle of a season. And so what we have here is that sort of cooperative society, but not just because, this sounds like a good thing to do. It's, if we don't do this, humanity goes extinct. So it's interesting to take the concept of like cooperative economics, where you want your community to build up the wealth of itself. You don't want an outside community taking all your money and all your wealth just being transferred elsewhere. But we have such a strict and just barely hanging on humanity. It's evolved to the point where there isn't really an economy anymore. It's not a thing that exists, because this is what your life is, this function, this role. And if you don't do that, humans go the way of the dodo. So it's really interesting to see, you could probably find all 7 principles of Kwanzaa that Kwanzaa talks about in play in the Broken Earth trilogy. I think it would probably be an interesting video for someone who's really well versed in Kwanzaa deeply to read or reread the Broken Earth trilogy and do a video about where each of these principles are functioning to some degree, whether on a small level or a hyper level. But I think they're all there in play, because they're all, I think, necessary for the soul of humanity in a way. And but the Broken Earth trilogy, I think, takes, like I said, that to the extreme. It's so far beyond that, where this isn't even an economic cooperation. It's cooperative survival as a species. And you perform some of the same functions where everything stays in-house, because you have to survive. Otherwise, your town is not going to survive. And if your town fails, you're pretty much, odds are you're going to be not one of the people who survives very long. But a great I know it sounds depressing as hell, but it is an absolute tour de force story. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Now, before I get to the next book or next story, I'm going to sidetrack to a movie, which isn't really on the category list, but I'm going to include it here anyway. And that is M. Night Shyamalan's The Village. And The Village, it has a similar, it's completely different, obviously, from the Broken Earth trilogy, but there's the one similarity in that it's a group of people living in this isolated village. And everyone has a role in that town. And so there's some surface similarities to the Broken Earth trilogy. The difference is, in Broken Earth, humanity itself is on the brink of extinction. Here, they're just trying to keep this self-contained, isolated society separate from the rest of the world. So it's for very different reasons, for very different purposes. But there's that similar where you've built a society that's so close-knit and so self-contained that something like an economy vanishes. And so it's interesting. It's not something that's scalable, really, on a mass scale, like probably for a large city or a nation. But it's an interesting experiment in The Village, the movie The Village. It's, as far as his movies go, it's my second favorite. But I just kind of, when I was thinking about what to talk about earlier about this video, that movie popped into my head, and there's certain similarities there where, again, not Ujamaa exactly, but it's where you could take it, depending upon the road you go down. Because that's one of the interesting things, particularly about this particular principle, the Day 4 principle, is this is one that it's easy to lose control of and be abused by the powerful. So it's one of the things that the principles of Kwanzaa on the surface may just seem pretty straightforward and simple, but they're really deep and complicated concepts. And cooperative economics is one that there's so many forks that road could take you to so many different outcomes, so many different directions. Many of them good and many of them disastrous. And it really depends upon the people involved and the focus and what you're trying to accomplish. And there are a lot of good pieces of humanity that can be abused by the very powerful, by governments and just powerful, corrupt people. So it's an interesting thing to reflect upon that aspect of it. I don't know if anyone looks at that aspect of it and looks not just how can we build this, but how has it been taken from us and twisted to avoid those kinds of mistakes for any kind of society in the past, from the past to the future. I don't know if I'm making any sense here. But anyway, on to the second story. And like I mentioned, I've been reading The Wheel of Time, and I'm just about finished with book 10 right now. I've got the prequel to read next, and then book 11. There's a whole Wheel of Time read-along that's going on, where they're starting up book 11 in January. So I've been barreling through books 5 through 10 to catch up. And one of my favorite things about this series so far is Jordan takes the time to show the impact of conflict and war on society, particularly on commerce. And you have, again, it's a similar sort of feudal, where there are nations, but the nations are really, what's the word? Epitomized? I'm not sure if that's the right word. Where it's that city in that nation is really what makes the nation. And the continent is populated with these places. And at the beginning of this story, you may have this city over here that is known, that's the cultural, artistic center. And this one over here is the textile center, or the blacksmith, or the tanners, where certain product, certain produce, certain spices, certain whatever, this is where they come from. This is the ones you want. And how conflict and war forces mass migration, some of which we're seeing now in our own world. And the impact that has upon a society economically and culturally, where you might have that particular skill set that's not necessarily unique to your place, but maybe unique, or maybe just that place excels at it. And migration through war may force that community to pick up and move over there. And by the end of this conflict, there's a completely different city that now has that. And they're becoming the economic powerhouse, and that original place is beginning to dwindle away. And it's interesting that there has to be some form of cooperative economics involved in the midst of all this conflict, because we read these books and they're always told through the eyes of, knights and wizards and the very powerful, the playmakers. We always see through their eyes. And we see glimpses of you're just, the small folk, as they're sometimes called, but just your average everyday people who farm and do all the jobs that make society function, all the jobs that bring money into these places for them to have their wealth and their armies and do all this stuff. And just think of the forms of like miniature cooperation that take place amongst these people whose total lives and cultures and identities are uprooted and thrown halfway across the continent. And there has to be some form of cooperation amongst these people so that they survive this, whether it's a journey by choice or a journey by force, or a journey by fate, wherever the conflict weaves and flows and ebbs and flows and takes them. It's hard to think that they can survive, as just little individuals, that they have to form some sort of cooperative unit, whether it's through trade, money, bartering, whatever, feeding each other, helping each other. And as I get deeper into the series, we're starting to see we're starting to see the impact of that more and more. Jordan takes the time to at least mention it, because some of the characters are people who are going to be in positions of that kind of power, and they need to know what's happening and how they can, not necessarily in a bad way, take advantage and bring some of those cultural, artistic, or economic centers to their cities, so that if everyone survives this conflict, their city, their people will come out of it better than they might have even been originally, or at least changed from how they survived before to how they survive and prosper now. And that's one of the things, again, that I like about this series, is you do see that. Now, a quick aside, no one does that better than George R.R. Martin. His Song of Ice and Fire series, the fourth book, A Feast for Crows, which for some people, a lot of people give a lot of not slack. People complain about that book a lot, and mainly because there's two main characters that just aren't in it. But to me, it's one of the absolute best fantasy books ever written, because the central theme of that book is the devastating impact war has. And a lot of the book is a couple of characters are traveling through the Riverlands in these particular places, in the Stormlands, and you're seeing the devastation that, kings and queens have wrought, fighting over a throne. And it really is, it's an appropriately named book, A Feast for Crows. But I don't want to get off on a tangent here, because that's really not about cooperative economics. It's just, if you want a really harsh, reality of what war does, particularly in that medieval sort of feudal setting, A Song of Ice and Fire just does an absolute brilliant job of it. Wheel of Time lets you know it's there and pops it up enough so that, you know it's happening, but it doesn't dwell deep into it like A Song of Ice and Fire does. But anyway, I think I'm kind of getting off track here. And the third book, and again, none of these stories are really fit cooperative economics. They're probably examples of how society messes everything up to get in the way of attempting to do these things. But the third story is the story of Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune, which, even though it's a far-flung future science fiction setting, it's still yet again a very feudal setting that we have here. There's an emperor and there's the great houses, and Dune, their whole economy revolves around this spice, which allows interstellar space travel. And you have the spice guilds and this one, like Choam or whatever they are, which is the main company that they're in charge of mining the spice. And they wield an exorbitant amount of power. They're almost as powerful as the emperor. The emperor and all these great houses own stock in these companies. And it's a sort of analogy to the British Empire and I think the East India Trade Company, and how powerful that became. And how even kings and queens owned stock in that company, and they were able to influence the decisions the governments, particularly in Great Britain, made to their benefit, of course. But the interesting part for Dune for me is the Fremen, who are sort of modeled after Bedouin in the deserts in the Middle East, but only to a degree. There are certain parts of their society that Frank Herbert didn't use. You could see from Wheel of Time, the Aiel are basically Jordan's version of the Fremen from Dune. But out of everybody on this planet, they're probably the ones that they understand what's behind this economic powerhouse of spice. And they know it's where it comes from, how it's made, and they're the ones who go out there and do the dirty work of mining it for these powerful houses and corporations. And they're able to, coexist with the desert. And nobody else, none of these other people who come here, these powerful lords and corporations, none of them know how to survive. But the Fremen have that. They cooperate with the desert itself and coexist with it and intermingle with it, and they understand the desert and how to live off of it. And from an economic standpoint, I mean, their whole economy really revolves around this spice. And they're the only ones who really understand what it is and what it does and kind of what its other purposes are. And it's just, again, none of these really fit the Ujamaa very well, because it's really hard to narrow this down in particular in speculative fiction, at least nothing that I've read recently. But all these three stories I've mentioned, they all center around pretty much a common theme, where what conflict does to people and communities and economics in particular. Taken to the extreme again, economics vanishes, like in the Broken Earth trilogy, because, I mean, you barely function as a society to even build something known as an economy. And in the Wheel of Time, it's how an economy can just pick up from that city and drop itself in that city because of war and conflict. And then in Dune, how this group of desert people that everyone just looks down on as like backward savages can live a fuller and truer life on this world than anybody else. All of these powerful people have no idea how to actually survive on that planet, and wouldn't survive on that planet without this Fremen that they look down upon. And I wonder how much does that connection to that specific land impact something like Ujamaa, like cooperative economics. I mean, in some ways, you have to have that intrinsic understanding of the land. I think from my Irish and Scottish side, where my family comes from, my ancestry is, there's a lot of that attachment to that particular land and understanding and knowing that land, and I think goes a long way to helping build this kind of cooperative economic construct. And it's the bigger challenge is translating it into the modern world, into today's cities, where, to take an example right now in Spanish Harlem, on the east side in Manhattan, El Barrio. Used to be mainly a Puerto Rican neighborhood. Now I'd say it's probably predominantly Mexican more than in Puerto Rican at this point. And there's been a more recent influx of Dominicans as well. But if you look at the store ownership, you had bodegas that used to be Spanish owned are now owned by Arabs. And in other parts of the city, more in the black neighborhoods, in the past, the bodegas were owned by Koreans. I'm not particularly sure who owns them in those neighborhoods today. I haven't lived in the city in a while, so I'm not well versed in how that ownership might have shifted towards more African American black ownership in those black communities, or if it's shifted from Korean to Arab, or like Spanish to Arab in other places. But it's interesting. You see, even in a neighborhood like El Barrio that is, ethnically Hispanic or Latin, Latinx, or whatever the terminology is today, it's still very disparate and different Hispanic communities, because they have some similarities in language, but a lot of the food, music, culture is very different from each other, even though they have a common base. But a lot of the shops are owned by people from other parts of the world. So it's interesting to see how many neighborhoods still have that, and I don't know if mononuclear is the right word, how many ethnic neighborhoods are still owned, where the stores and businesses are still owned by that ethnicity. I mean, how much of Little Italy is Italian anymore? Chinatown seems to be, well, you could say Chinatown is owned by the Chinese, but you also have a big Vietnamese contingent there as well. So that's kind of a mix. But it's interesting. So, like I said, these are really complicated constructs and concepts, even though on the surface, they seem like generally simpler things. And this was probably just a totally rambling, completely missing the mark video, but yeah, this was a tough one, but very enjoyable to sit, and I've sat and thought about this for a while. Hopefully this made some sense. Hopefully you got something out of it. And before I wrap up here, I just want to let you know that there is a contest, a giveaway that Jerry of Onyx Pages is doing in relation to this Kwanzaa Reflect-a-thon. All the details, I will link her to her video down below that has all the details to the whole thing. And I just want to thank Jerry. This was for the opportunity to participate in this. It's a really interesting exercise, contemplative exercise as well, to just sit and learn about something that's a bit outside of my own culture, and to dive into it and think about it a little more and see how it can impact me and just society in general. And it's always a good thing to learn concepts and what they mean to the people who create them, and why and where they come from. I think it gives us a better understanding of each other as people. And I think that is it. I am Charles, SirBookSage. Happy reading.